Emma Thompson never expected her fresh start in a quiet town to turn into a nightmare, but then she met Officer Mark Simmons. What began as a routine traffic stop soon spiraled into a dangerous obsession that would leave a young woman fighting for her life, and a trusted officer forever changed. This is the chilling story of how one police officer's fixation on an 18-year-old girl led to a tragic and irreversible end. It was a small, quiet town where everyone knew everyone else's business. In a community where the streets were lined with oak trees and the sounds of kids playing echoed through the neighborhood, Officer Mark Simmons was a well-respected figure. He had served on the local police force for over a decade and had built a reputation for being reliable, professional, and committed to keeping the peace. People saw him as someone they could trust, someone who would always have their backs. He was a pillar of the community, a person who followed the rules, upheld the law, and protected those in need. But beneath his stoic demeanor, something was changing. Simmons, like many officers, had spent years dealing with the darker side of life, crime, addiction, and the undercurrents of human nature that often went unseen. He had seen a lot over the years, and while he prided himself on being able to separate his personal life from his professional one, there were times when it became difficult. That difficulty would come to a head the day he met Emma. Emma had just turned 18 and moved to town to live with her aunt, after a difficult childhood in the city. She was fresh-faced, beautiful, and full of life, everything the town didn't have much of. Her family had little means, and the small town offered her a chance to start over, away from the chaos and hardship she had known. Emma enrolled in the local community college and began working part-time at a diner, trying to build a new life for herself. From the moment Simmons first encountered her, something inside him shifted. It wasn't love or infatuation at first, it was a simple encounter that seemed harmless enough. She was pulled over for a minor traffic violation one afternoon, a routine stop. Simmons approached her car, offering his usual calm and friendly demeanor. Emma was nervous, but he reassured her and gave her a warning instead of a ticket. She was polite and apologetic, just trying to get through her day, but Simmons couldn't help but notice the way her eyes looked, wide and uncertain but filled with something else, something he couldn't quite place. For weeks after that, Simmons found himself thinking about Emma. It wasn't just her beauty, though that certainly played a part. There was something about her innocence, the vulnerability she exuded, that piqued his interest. She was like a blank canvas, a fresh start in a town that had long since grown familiar. His attention, at first, was subtle. He would drive by the diner where she worked, just to catch a glimpse of her through the window. He didn't know why he felt this pull towards her, he had never been like this before. She was just a young woman, a stranger, and yet he found himself drawn to her. It was harmless, at first. A passing thought here and there. But it wasn't long before he started to notice her more often. Whenever he was on patrol, he would find reasons to stop by the park, the coffee shop, or even the corner store. He didn't think she noticed, or if she did, she didn't seem to mind. Emma was polite, but she didn't seem overly friendly, and Simmons could read that as a sign of independence. That, in itself, intrigued him more. She wasn't like the other women in town, who were always happy to chat or engage. Emma kept to herself, a quiet figure who didn't seem interested in drawing attention. Over time, Simmons found himself becoming more obsessed with Emma. He tried to convince himself it was just curiosity, that it would pass. But it didn't. Instead, he began making excuses to interact with her more. Just small things, stopping to offer advice about her car, asking how her day was going. He justified it by telling himself he was just being friendly, looking out for a young woman new to the area. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. And he couldn't stop it. As the weeks passed, Officer Simmons' fascination with Emma grew deeper. At first, it seemed harmless. He'd bump into her at the local coffee shop or see her walking her dog in the park. He would strike up casual conversations, nothing too intrusive, but each encounter felt like a small victory to him. There was something magnetic about her, her shy smile, the way she listened intently when he spoke, as if he were the only person in the room. It made him feel special, as if he held some kind of power over her. Emma, for her part, didn't know what to make of the officer's growing presence in her life. At first, she chalked it up to coincidence. It was a small town, after all, and people tended to run into each other more often than they would in a larger city. She didn't think much of it when he appeared at the diner during her shifts or when she saw him walking his beat in the neighborhood. He was just another figure in town, a friendly, approachable police officer who seemed genuinely interested in her well-being. But as time went on, the encounters began to feel more deliberate. It wasn't just that Simmons was showing up in places she frequented, it was the way he seemed to always know where she'd be. If she went for a jog in the early morning, he'd appear on his patrol, offering a friendly wave. If she went into the grocery store, she'd turn to find him there, seemingly by chance. The conversations grew longer, and his questions started to feel more personal, questions about her family, her past, her plans for the future. Emma started to feel uneasy. She didn't want to be rude, especially to someone in authority, but she couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in Simmons' behavior. His compliments were no longer casual, they felt more loaded. "You're so different from the other women here," he'd say, his voice lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. "You've got a spark. You'll go far." Emma wasn't sure how to respond to these comments. She wasn't sure how to make him understand that she was just being polite, that she wasn't interested in anything more than a simple, friendly conversation. The more she tried to distance herself, the more he seemed to close in. He began showing up at places she hadn't told him about. She'd go to the park to read a book, only to find him sitting on a bench nearby, watching her from across the path. He'd wave, and she'd give a small, uncomfortable wave back. His presence was like a shadow, always lurking, always a little too close for comfort. One evening, when she was leaving the diner after a late shift, Simmons offered to walk her home. It wasn't the first time he'd made such an offer, but this time, something about it felt different. She felt a tightening in her chest as he walked alongside her, his stride matching hers in a way that felt intentional. He talked about safety, about the dangers of the town, about how he always kept an eye on the people he cared about. Emma's heart raced, and she instinctively quickened her pace, trying to escape the intensity of his words. When they reached her apartment, she gave him a quick thank you and rushed inside, locking the door behind her. It wasn't the first time she'd felt the need to retreat, but this time, the feeling lingered long after she was safe behind closed doors. She began to confide in her friends about Simmons, though none of them seemed to take her seriously. They thought she was just overreacting, chalking it up to the overzealous nature of a small-town cop. They told her he was just being kind, that he probably didn't mean anything by it. But deep down, Emma knew something wasn't right. There was a distance growing between her and everyone else in the town. The people she'd met seemed to fall into two categories, those who found Simmons' attention flattering and those who didn't understand why she couldn't just accept his friendliness. And then there was Simmons, who, in his own way, seemed to be watching her every move. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was closing in, like a predator silently circling its prey. The more she tried to ignore it, the more his presence seemed to loom over her. Still, she didn't know what to do. How do you confront a man who holds authority, someone who's meant to protect you, without the risk of making things worse? Emma felt trapped in a web she couldn't see clearly, unsure how to escape without making everything worse. What began as a series of seemingly innocent encounters had slowly evolved into something far more sinister, and Emma was beginning to realize that the officer she once thought of as trustworthy was no longer just an acquaintance, he was a man obsessed. The situation escalated one evening when Emma found herself alone and vulnerable, a feeling she had never truly experienced before in the small town she had come to call home. She had just finished her shift at the diner, exhausted from hours of serving customers and trying to maintain a smile. The night was quiet as she stepped outside into the cool air, the streets empty and peaceful. It was a routine she had grown accustomed to, but that night, something felt different. As she walked down the street, she noticed Officer Simmons' patrol car parked at the corner. At first, she thought little of it. It wasn't unusual for him to be nearby on his rounds, but as she drew closer, she saw that he was sitting in the driver's seat, waiting. He rolled down the window and waved at her with an overly cheerful smile. Emma hesitated, wondering if she should walk around the block to avoid him, but she was too tired to care. Simmons called out to her, offering a casual greeting, and before she could decline, he asked if she needed a ride. She knew she could make it home on her own, it wasn't far, and she was used to walking late at night, but something about his offer made her hesitate. Part of her felt a flicker of dread, but she forced herself to push it down. After all, he was a police officer, someone who had only ever shown kindness in their interactions, and what harm could there be in accepting a ride from him? Emma got in, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in her stomach. The car smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent that seemed to linger in the air longer than it should have. Simmons started talking, as he always did, about the town, about safety, about the weather, nothing out of the ordinary. But the words felt heavier tonight, and the air in the car felt thicker, more oppressive. Emma noticed that Simmons wasn't heading directly toward her apartment. He turned onto a road she didn't recognize, driving slowly, almost deliberately. "Just taking a detour," Simmons said, his tone light but his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I wanted to show you a better route home. It's a quieter road, safer at night." Emma's heart began to race. She tried to push the anxiety aside, telling herself that maybe he was just trying to be helpful, but the words felt rehearsed. She glanced out the window, unsure of where they were going. The streetlights grew more spaced out, the houses less frequent. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew she didn't feel safe. "Simmons, I think you've passed my turn," Emma said, her voice betraying her discomfort. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he kept driving, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Emma's pulse quickened, her body growing tense as the reality of the situation hit her. She was alone in a car with a man she had come to fear, someone who had crossed so many boundaries without her consent, all masked by the badge he wore. Simmons turned to her, and for the first time, his expression wasn't warm or friendly. His eyes were cold, calculating, as if he were trying to make her understand something only he knew. "I just wanted to talk," he said, his voice low and almost possessive. "You've been avoiding me, Emma. I thought maybe we could have a real conversation." The realization hit Emma with a jolt. This wasn't about helping her, and it hadn't been for some time. Simmons wasn't just a well-meaning officer anymore. His obsession with her had turned darker, more dangerous. She felt a cold sweat form on her palms as she tried to steady her breathing. Without thinking, she grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't open. Panic flooded her chest. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice shaking now. Simmons seemed unbothered by her fear. He turned the car around, finally heading back in the direction of her apartment, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted permanently between them. He drove slowly, as if savoring every second of the control he had over her. As they neared her building, Emma tried to compose herself, putting on a brave face as she thanked him for the ride. But Simmons didn't let her leave without one last comment, a final, chilling remark that would stay with her for days. "I'll be seeing you around, Emma. You can't avoid me forever." She got out of the car quickly, her legs trembling beneath her. As she hurried inside, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart still racing. The fear that had gnawed at her for weeks had finally boiled over, and Emma knew that her life had irrevocably changed. The town she had once found comforting now felt like a cage, and the man who had once seemed like a protector had become something far more terrifying. The feeling of being watched didn't stop when she was inside her apartment. It followed her everywhere. Each time she left the building, she felt Simmons' eyes on her, his presence lurking just out of sight. She had tried to rationalize his behavior for so long, but the truth was undeniable now, he was a predator, and she was his target. As the days passed, Emma's anxiety began to consume her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Officer Simmons was always nearby, watching her every move. He had become a shadow in her life, lurking in the background of even her most mundane activities. No matter where she went, no matter how much she tried to avoid him, Simmons was there, always just a little too close. His presence was suffocating, and it felt like the walls of her small world were closing in around her. The subtle encounters turned into something more deliberate, more invasive. He began to show up at the diner during her shifts, sometimes just to sit at a table in the back, his eyes never leaving her. Other times, he'd walk past the front windows, just slow enough for her to notice him standing there, watching her as she worked. She could feel his gaze even when she wasn't looking directly at him. His presence was always there, a constant, unnerving force that made her skin crawl. Simmons would often linger after his meal, making small talk about the weather, the town, or just general pleasantries. He would ask about her day, offering unsolicited advice about how she should be careful walking alone at night, about the dangers lurking in the shadows. His words felt more like warnings than casual conversation. Emma started to avoid making eye contact with him, not wanting to encourage any more interaction, but it seemed to only fuel his obsession further. He took her silence as an invitation to talk longer, to share more of his thoughts, and his presence became more insistent with each passing day. It wasn't just at the diner anymore. Simmons began showing up at her apartment complex, though not in a way that could be immediately considered suspicious. He'd park his car across the street, just outside the building, and sit there for hours, his eyes fixed on the entrance. Sometimes, he'd be there when she left for work, and other times, he'd be waiting when she returned. He'd wave as if they were old friends, but Emma didn't wave back. She didn't want to acknowledge him, and she certainly didn't want to let him know that his behavior was scaring her. One afternoon, as she was walking to the local store to pick up a few things, she felt an all-too-familiar chill creep up her spine. Looking over her shoulder, she saw Simmons leaning against his patrol car, his gaze following her every step. He wasn't even pretending to be subtle anymore. She quickened her pace, but he continued to watch, as if he were waiting for something, or perhaps for her to do something. It was as though he were silently daring her to break down, to acknowledge the tension that had been building between them. Emma had had enough. Her nerves were frayed, and she knew she couldn't go on like this much longer. She had tried to distance herself, to ignore the unease that was growing in her chest, but every time she saw Simmons, it only deepened. She decided it was time to take action, time to confront him. Even if it meant risking everything. She couldn't bear to let this continue. With a mix of dread and determination, Emma sent a text to her aunt, telling her she was going to meet Simmons in person. She didn't know what she hoped to accomplish, but she had to make it clear to him that his behavior wasn't acceptable. She had to tell him to stop, to end this suffocating cycle before it spiraled any further. That night, Emma agreed to meet Simmons at a secluded area near the edge of town. It wasn't a place she would normally go, but she knew it was where they could talk alone, without anyone interrupting them. The streetlights flickered above as she waited in the darkness, the cold air biting at her skin. Her heart raced as she heard the familiar hum of Simmons' patrol car pull up behind her. He got out of the car slowly, wearing the same neutral expression he always wore. He smiled, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite place. Emma's stomach turned as she forced herself to stand tall, but she couldn't ignore the fear that tightened her chest. She needed to speak up, to put an end to this, but the words felt stuck in her throat. Simmons spoke first, his voice smooth and calm. He asked her how she had been, like they were just two friends catching up. But there was an underlying tension in his voice, something dark and unsettling. He didn't seem to notice, or care, about the discomfort in her posture, the way she avoided looking at him. His gaze remained on her, steady and unnerving. Emma's voice was barely a whisper when she finally spoke, her words trembling with the weight of the situation. She told him she didn't want to see him anymore, that she wasn't comfortable with the way he'd been acting. She tried to remain firm, but the fear inside her was like a storm brewing, threatening to break free. Instead of reacting with understanding or backing off, Simmons' expression shifted. His eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, Emma saw a flicker of something darker in his gaze, something possessive. He didn't take her words seriously. He didn't want to hear her rejection. He wasn't going to let her go that easily. As he stepped closer, his tone grew more insistent. He told her she didn't understand, that they were meant to be together. Emma could feel the air growing heavier, the silence stretching between them, until every breath felt like it could be her last. Fear gripped her like a vice, but she tried to hold her ground. She couldn't let him control her anymore. She had to get away, had to break free from his suffocating hold before it was too late. But Simmons, consumed by his obsession, had already made up his mind. The twisted reality he had created in his mind would not allow her to escape so easily. The night Emma confronted Officer Simmons marked the beginning of a terrifying and irreversible shift in her life. Though she managed to walk away from their encounter with her body still intact, she knew the truth: she wasn't free. The darkness in Simmons' eyes, the chilling sense of entitlement he displayed as she spoke, left her with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was clear now, he wouldn't let her go so easily. The thought lingered in her mind throughout the following days, gnawing at her, tightening her chest with every passing hour. There was no escaping him, no matter how far she ran. Her attempts to avoid him had become futile. He continued to appear where she least expected it, always at the diner, always near her apartment, always watching her with that unsettling gaze. Even the simple act of walking to the store, which had once been an ordinary part of her routine, felt like a risky maneuver, like stepping into the open only to find herself trapped in plain sight. The community, her friends, even her aunt, had begun to notice the shift in her behavior. Emma was withdrawing, growing more anxious with each passing day. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't do anything without thinking about the officer who had become her personal nightmare. No one else seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Most people still saw Simmons as a dedicated, reliable officer, a man who could do no wrong. Even when she confided in her aunt, Emma's fears were met with uncertainty. "He's just being friendly, sweetheart," her aunt had said, trying to console her. "He's a good man. He's just looking out for you." But Emma knew better. She could feel the malevolent force behind his so-called kindness. Every smile he flashed her, every unsolicited offer of help, felt like an attempt to further control her, to force her into a role she didn't want. He wasn't being friendly. He wasn't looking out for her. He was luring her deeper into his twisted obsession, and she was powerless to stop it. Then came the night that everything unraveled. Emma had just gotten off work at the diner. It was late, and she had hoped to return to her apartment quietly, without incident. The town was quieter than usual, the streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. But as she neared her apartment building, the sickening sense of being watched returned. She tried to ignore it, walking quickly toward the door, her keys already in her hand. That's when she heard the unmistakable hum of a car engine. She froze. Looking over her shoulder, Emma saw the silhouette of Simmons' patrol car parked just outside her building, the headlights off but the engine still running. Her heart skipped a beat, a cold shiver running down her spine. She had to make it inside, away from him, but her feet felt like they were stuck in place. Her hand gripped the doorknob tightly as she began to panic. Before she could open the door, Simmons stepped out from the shadows, his figure tall and imposing against the dim light. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there, watching her with that same unnerving intensity that had become all too familiar. The air between them was thick with tension. "Emma," he said softly, his voice low and almost soothing. "I've been waiting for you." Fear surged through her, and she instinctively took a step back. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound firm. His eyes darkened, and for the first time, she saw the raw intensity of his obsession. "I just want you to understand," he said, stepping closer. "I've been patient, but I don't think you understand what we're supposed to be. You're the only one who can see it now." Emma's stomach churned, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The realization hit her like a thunderclap: he wasn't just obsessed with her anymore, he was desperate. Desperate to make her see things his way, desperate to control her, to claim her as his own. She backed away, trying to think, trying to come up with some kind of plan, but her mind raced too fast to form coherent thoughts. She knew what would happen if she didn't get away from him. She knew he wouldn't stop until he had everything he wanted. Suddenly, Simmons lunged at her, grabbing her wrist with a grip that felt like iron. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the quiet night. No one was around to help, and the streets seemed impossibly empty. She struggled, fighting against his hold, but he was stronger, his presence overpowering. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the extent of his madness. In a desperate attempt, she yanked her arm free and broke into a run, heading toward the back entrance of her building, but Simmons was right behind her. She could hear his footsteps pounding against the pavement, too close for comfort. Her thoughts were a blur, only one thing mattered now, survival. She reached the building's back door and fumbled with her keys, but before she could unlock it, Simmons caught up with her. He shoved her roughly against the wall, his breath hot and ragged against her ear. "You can't escape me, Emma," he whispered. "You were always meant to be mine." In that moment, the world around her seemed to stop. She had no way out. She had no one to turn to. Officer Mark Simmons, the man who had sworn to protect, had become her tormentor, and no matter how much she fought, no matter how loud she screamed, it was clear that the nightmare she had feared was only just beginning. The last thing Emma remembered was the searing pain, and then everything went black.